24 hours in the trenches, a day in the life of a WWI soldier. Ask anyone to tell you something about the First World War, and it's almost certain that the trenches will be one of the first things mentioned. Trenches have become the enduring symbol of the Great War, representing both the brutality and the monotonous grind that defined the conflict. But what exactly was life like in these trenches for the ordinary soldier? To understand the true nature of the war, it's essential to delve into a typical day in the life of a soldier on the front lines. The purpose and structure of trenches. Trenches were more than just ditches dug into the ground. They were highly organized systems designed to offer protection from the deadly firepower of modern warfare. By the late stages of the war, these trenches stretched over 400 miles from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, creating a continuous line of defense that defined the Western Front. A typical trench system was composed of several lines: the front line, where soldiers were stationed to defend against enemy attacks, the support line, which provided a fallback position, and the reserve line, where troops could rest and resupply. These trenches were interconnected by communication trenches, which allowed soldiers to move between positions with some degree of safety. The German trenches, built with a more permanent philosophy in mind, were often more robust than their British and French counterparts, featuring deep dugouts and fortified positions designed to withstand prolonged attacks. Dawn, stand to, and the start of the day. A soldier's day in the trenches began before dawn with the order to stand to. This command required every man in the section to man the parapet, bayonets fixed, ready to repel any potential dawn assault by the enemy. The early morning hours were considered the most likely time for an attack, and the soldiers had to be on high alert as the first light of day crept over the battlefield. Once full daylight arrived and the immediate threat of an attack had passed, most of the soldiers were allowed to stand down, leaving only one man on sentry duty. The rest of the men would then receive their daily rum ration, a much-anticipated moment that provided a brief respite from the grim realities of trench life. Breakfast followed, with rations typically consisting of bread, bacon, cheese, and the ubiquitous corned beef. Despite the challenging conditions, food was generally plentiful, as the high physical demands of trench life required a significant caloric intake. Morning. Hygiene and weapon maintenance. After breakfast, soldiers took care of personal hygiene, an essential routine in the trenches. Shaving was mandatory, not just for appearance but for practical reasons. Stubble could prevent a gas mask from sealing properly, which could be fatal in the event of a gas attack. The soldiers often used the last of their tea to shave, making the most of the limited resources available. By mid-morning, half of the section would be detailed to clean their weapons. Keeping rifles and other equipment in top condition was crucial, as a malfunction in the heat of battle could mean the difference between life and death. Only half of the section cleaned their weapons at a time to ensure that there were always men ready to respond to an enemy attack. The platoon sergeant would then make his rounds, inspecting the trenches and the soldiers under his command. Any infractions, such as a dirty weapon or an unshaven face, could result in punishment, ranging from extra duties to loss of pay. Maintaining discipline was critical in the trenches, where the slightest lapse could have catastrophic consequences. Afternoon, respite and routine. The afternoon brought a brief period of relative calm. Lunch, typically a hot stew brought up from the reserve lines, provided another opportunity for the men to rest and recharge. Mail from home was distributed during this time, offering a much-needed morale boost. Letters from loved ones were cherished, and soldiers would often share the small luxuries sent from home, such as sweets or tobacco. After lunch, those not on sentry duty had a few hours of free time. This might be spent writing letters, chatting with comrades, or catching up on sleep. Despite the ever-present danger, these quiet moments allowed the soldiers to maintain some semblance of normalcy amid the chaos of war. Dusk. The tension returns. As dusk approached, the tension in the trenches began to rise again. The order to stand to was repeated, and the soldiers took up their positions on the parapet once more. The fading light made this a particularly nerve-wracking time, as the shadows played tricks on the eyes, and every movement could be a potential threat. Smoking, talking, or any unnecessary movement was strictly forbidden to avoid drawing enemy fire. Once darkness had fully set in, the soldiers were allowed to stand down, but the night's work was far from over. 1/3 of the section remained on sentry duty at all times, with shifts rotating every hour. For those not on duty, it was time for supper, often a simple meal of soup, possibly enhanced with a condiment sent from home. Night. The true work begins. Nich was weng the treshes trui kei to lef. The coer os darshes alloe fortas chak werisho dacharois during the day sush as repairing the tresh parabas lair new barbe wir or even venturing into no man's land to repair defences. These tasks were grueling and often dangerous, particularly when enemy snipers or artillery opened fire. Trench raids were a constant threat during the night. These raids involved small groups of enemy soldiers crossing no man's land to attack a section of the trench, using grenades, clubs and knives in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Even on nights when no raids occurred, the anticipation of such an attack made sleep difficult and fragmented. Soldiers were lucky to get a few hours of rest before being called back to sentry duty. The endless cycle. Life in the trenches. Life in the trenches was a relentless cycle of monotony, exhaustion, and fear. Soldiers typically spent 4 days in the front line, followed by 4 days in support and 8 days in reserve. This rotation was essential for maintaining the physical and mental health of the men, as continuous exposure to the front-line conditions would have been unsustainable. Despite the popular image of constant battle, most of a soldier's time in the trenches was spent enduring the hardships of trench life rather than engaging in combat. As one veteran famously remarked, "For me, the war was 90% bored stiff, 9% frozen stiff, and 1% scared stiff." Yet it was this endurance, the ability to carry on despite the mud, the rats, the constant shelling, and the ever-present threat of death, that defined the courage of the soldiers who fought in the Great War.
The legacy of trench warfare.
The trenches of World War I have come to symbolize the futility and horror of war. They were places of unimaginable suffering, where young men lived in squalor, faced daily danger, and watched their comrades fall. Yet, they were also places where bonds were forged, and acts of incredible bravery occurred. Today, the remnants of these trenches can still be found in the fields of France and Belgium, silent witnesses to the sacrifices made by a generation. The story of life in the trenches is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the heavy toll that war exacts on those who fight it. It is a story that continues to resonate, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten.